Hello, nerds.
I'm going to show you how I would layer and glaze using a combination of both. Contrast, a lot of times, it really begins with the value of the paint that you're painting, right? So, with me starting here with like green over black, go very thick. I don't have much thinner, no water on the brush really. We're just kind of throwing green over the black and let that first coat inherit some of the black. But you could start with a darker color and that would start building your contrast quicker. So if I started this with black green or with, dark camo green or something, then I might get more contrast at an earlier stage. So that's always a choice that you have. But if you're trying to get like really bright vibrancy, then, a darker green may not be the place you wanted to start on this. Just using this, kind of green to yellow-green transition. Think of doing like, colorful, playful goblin flesh or something. I have to do this painting so fast as we go that it's like, it becomes difficult to not tear the paint. So I'll wait a little bit longer between layers. Well, so there's a million ways to blend. Maybe not a million, but there's a lot of ways to blend, right? You can layer blend, which is what you see me do most of the time. And layer blending is done by mixing colors that are close in proximity and hue and value the way you want them to be, and then putting them one over the top of the other. I'll be doing some of that here. Just got to make sure this isn't overly wet before I put the second coat on. Otherwise, it'll just move the base coat. Cool, dry air. Best way to speed up the dry time on any of your paints. If you're using a hair dryer, use it on cool. Do not use it on hot or even warm. Most hair dryers have a cool setting. Always use the cool setting. Okay, so the first layer, you're right, it's exhibiting some of the black. So it creates more of a shade color for me right off the bat. But again, without any thinning, I'll just come back in and now start to layer up. So I get my opacity. This is that standard, put 2 coats on over black to get a nice buildup of your central hue. And by leaving a lot of the green that's in the shadow alone, I maintain some of that darkness. So I really start thinking in terms of where highlights would go with my base coat. I generally wouldn't base with a green like this. It's too bright, but we'll use it for vibrancy's sake. This would be a mid-tone color in my world. But the second layer will get rid of brush texture, things like that, and give the opacity you're looking for on the model. Okay, so the green that still has the black in it, even as though it is messy, leave it in the shadows, and then just highlight the spots that move away from the shadows into light. This method of painting allows your first, or any color in any step of your process, to do more heavy lifting, right? Because I can come back with even a third coat and pull that in a little bit tighter. And when I say that, I mean that I'm doing this, right? I'm painting my first coat of paint over the entire surface. So consider this the whole surface, right? Then with the second coat, and this will it will allow some of the surface underneath to show through, which is why I prefer to use black as a primer, because now the black will show through the green and make the green much darker. Then my second layer, I'm only painting, that much of the surface. I'm letting this much of the surface remain that darker green that shows some of the black through. Then I'm covering this much of it that makes that more green. Less of the black shows. Then on my third surface, I probably do something like this. And now I have this much that is, mostly green, but a little black. This is 50-50 green and black, and this is all green now. So that one color gives me all of this contrast. But of course, this is assuming that you're painting from a black base for shadow. If you paint from a white base, you just kind of have to turn this thought process on its head. You'll notice how I have the kind of chunky green black up underneath there. I've got green black on here with the second coat. And then for the third coat, instead of going up to that shadow line like I just did, I will then come in and do just this area here, about the lower 2/3. So now I get a blended green. Now, obviously, when I'm painting quick like this, it's not going to be as nice as it could be when you're doing it, but you get the gist. So again, dark where the black and the green overlap, so I get a darker green. Then the second coat gives me a semi-opaque green, and then I come back in and cover 2/3 of that with a third coat. And then I would just do that in every area. So that now I already have the foundation of contrast built into the green from the get-go, right? Then if I wanted to move this to, say, bright yellow green, I would take bright yellow green, which is a lower opacity color because of the intensity of the yellow in it. So the yellow lacks opacity as a natural pigment. If you've ever painted with yellow, you know the issue in getting yellows to get to full opacity. Again, just some cool dry air from the airbrush, no paint. Make sure I get that to where it's not going to move around on me. Then a little bit of dampness on my brush, get the bright yellow green. The bright yellow green is going to act more like a glaze. See how I'm being able to see the green and the white through it? So that knows it's going to just give me the slight tint effect. And on the first layer again, I'm going to paint probably all the way up into those shadows again on this. Across the whole surface. Because the glaze will just start to alter the color below it a little bit. Notice how my brush stroke is always going to the spot that is brightest when I paint this way. But I do want to get color up into the shadow as well, so that it doesn't look like, you know, there's broad, you know, I don't know, stains of color. Everything inherits all of the color of the material. If it's going to move to a yellowish tone, then all of the fabric would have that yellowish tone, unless this was some sort of OSL. So there's one layer of it with the bright yellow green on there. Speed the drying up a bit again. Now on the second layer, less water on my brush, so the brush will stay just slightly damp. I don't want a whole lot of water on it. So you see it's still shiny, has a little bit of dampness, but not dripping with water. Go and get the paint. The paint is now going to have more of an opacity to it. Look how it's covering the green now, but it's still, because of the nature of this paint, right, it still shows a little bit through. I take that paint and I go in again, just like like with the green, I want to now not cover the whole area. I want to pull this down and do just the lower 2/3 of this area. Like so. Right, same down here. Not push it all the way into the shadows, but continue with my brush stroke, just reaching a bit into the darkness and then pulling out towards the edge. Bit into the darkness, pull out towards the edge. Then down here too. I'm not even worried about the areas that were in darkness before. It doesn't matter. Leave them alone. And maybe this top piece here. I think I forgot that with the first layer, maybe. Then we dry that up. Then come back with another layer. Again, not much moisture on my brush. I don't want to thin this too much. Just enough to keep the opacity lowered a little bit. And then do the last third maybe. Out towards where the highlight would be. Down here it's a little harder because it's not much area being covered. So it's a little bitty tiny brush strokes. Okay. Again, you'll notice that as I go along, my brushstrokes no longer reach into the shadows at all, right? So the shadows are still almost just that pure green and black that they were originally. Yeah. So that builds that contrast in. And then when I go to the last, probably the last, we'll call this coat 4 of the bright yellow green, right? Then I'm just basically along the edge with it, right? It's, again, about reducing the amount of area you cover each time you add another layer. Because if you just keep adding layers over the same exact spot, you'll never build up contrast, right? And you'll lose all that coloration that you had underneath, which acts as a vehicle for some of that desaturation. So again, you know, if you can zoom in close.
Yeah.
you can see where my last layer went up to this height here. Then I want to come down and split that in half. So the next layer just sits right in there, 50% of that. Still technically glazing. I'm just building up more color here. I'm not really worried about covering that edge 100%, but I could be a little bit more careful with all that if I wanted to. And then same thing down here. I have this layer that's just this narrow band. So here it's almost like stippling. Here I'm just really just punching the brush against the model to make this stippled line of brightness right there. And down here it's like a dot. Boom. Yeah. Well, and think, like, I could go back. I'm going to carry this through if you don't mind. I'm going to go ahead and add pale yellow, because pale yellow would be a perfect highlight for this. And this color I wouldn't glaze necessarily. This color, I'll get a smaller brush for one, because I'm just doing the edges. But imagine doing something like, you know, going in with this. The pale yellow, because of the amount of white that it has to brighten it up, is a more opaque color. So I just take this, and again, you know, my area that I painted that last stripe is very, very narrow, right? And so I have to come in and only cover half of that with the highlight. Oh, my brush isn't wet enough to even get paint off it there. Got to have enough dampness to have the brush flow paint off of it, of course, right? And then I just come in with like something like this, just at the very edge of that. Again, here, you know, taking the liberty to create some texture with it as if it were the thread in the fabric, but remembering to only cover about 50% of the area of previous color so that I'm always letting my previous color show through. And then, you know, I can catch this edge up here. This surface doesn't really face us much, so the color isn't as readily visible, but I can catch that edge, right? And so now I've got, while being very painterly, because I'm painting quickly, you know, and you could stop there, right? And you could have a nice work up from your green to your yellows. You've got a lot of contrast. You've got shine along the edges. You've got shadow underneath. Obviously, be a little bit less careless with your paint as you're going, as I was doing it quick. But you have a really nice work up that maintains vibrancy, has used the power of glazing. Now, if you did like this and you wanted to do it fast, you're doing an army, check this magic out. If I do this, and then I go back to green, right, which I still have some on the palette actually, and I turn the green into a pretty sturdy glaze. I've got a lot of water on the brush, and I go into my green to make it really, really thin, right? So this would be like an ultra thin glaze. You can see on my finger as I run it back over all of those colors what's going to happen, right? This can be used as a blending glaze at the end, and you put this over everything, right? Come back and pile that over the whole thing. And what this does is allow your messy brush strokes, if you're painting armies and going fast, this will help blend a little bit of that, gets rid of a little bit of that messiness, right? Can smooth things out. Bring everything back to a central hue of green too. Take that yellow, that bright pale yellow that we put on there, right? And give it a little bit more of a green tone. You can do that up into the shadows as well, right? And then boom, now you've kind of blended everything back together, and look how smooth that gives you very quickly. That's the power of glazing. Now I've got my contrast, I've got my vibrancy. I didn't take a lot of time. I didn't use more than 3 or 4 steps of any of those colors. And in the last ones, I used like 2 or 3, right? Or even 1 on the highlight. And now all of a sudden you can get the power that you want and maintain the vibrancy, be confident in your blending and things of that nature. So it's a really fast way to do it. It's the same way that we did this red. You know, you can do it with any coloring. It's just the way that my brain starts is saying that I can turn one color into a very powerful tool by using the first layer of that color at a very low opacity so that it lets the color underneath it show through, even if that color is just the dark color of the primer. And then the second pass with that same color, more opacity, so it gives more vibrancy of that color into the areas, and start working it towards my highlight. So that 50-50 thing where I've painted the first layer over everything, the second layer covers only about 75% of that, and the last layer covers 50% of the last one. And if I wanted to do another layer, it would do an even shorter amount, cover less. So I get all of that blending showing through with one color, if that makes sense. And that way you can get really good results very, very quickly This, you could paint an army like this, and this didn't take us any time at all, especially if you're drawing in between with the airbrush and really working fast. Right? So you can see that this same process works well for fast painting, and you can also spend more time on your brush strokes and make it for display quality painting too. It doesn't mean you have to add more layers for better quality. Same amount of layers, just more time and technique application to make sure you're not as sketchy as I was here.